about Daniel chapter 5 and Belshazzar's feast.
Good.
So we should talk about the reign of Belshazzar for a little bit first here, though. And so if you look up behind me, before we get to Belshazzar, we're leaving Nebuchadnezzar in the dust. And we didn't say this on chapter 4, but that was the last chapter of Nebuchadnezzar, so we don't have to worry about him anymore. But here's the historical sequence, at least as far as we can tell from history. Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar takes control of Judah in about 605 BC. Okay, now these dates are a little bit squishy because they didn't number the things exactly for us, so that we could say it's exactly 605, but it's like, in the third year of the reign of Jeconiah, then this happened or whatever. So we have to do all this kind of adjustments. But in about 605, 604-ish, something like that, 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar takes control of Judah. But he doesn't destroy Jerusalem, but they invade Judah, takes control of it. And almost all of the people of Judah are taken captive to Babylon. Just a few are left. So this is when Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Daniel and the three guys, they're taken to Babylon, 605 BC. And that's when the exile to Babylon starts. Okay? So that happens. Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians 18 years later in 587 BC. And so for 18 years, Nebuchadnezzar is in control of Jerusalem, and there is a king in Judah, but he's what they call a puppet king. Okay, he's basically controlled by the Babylonians, more or less, until Nebuchadnezzar says, enough is enough, I've had it with this joker. And they go back and destroy the city of Jerusalem in 587 BC, and that's 2 Kings 25. Okay, so that's there. And by that time, Daniel and the boys have been in Babylon for 18 years. Okay, now we get to Daniel 7, which we haven't got to yet. We will in a couple weeks, but Belshazzar becomes king in 553 BC. And so let me say this. The chapters in Daniel are out of order chronologically. So in chapter 5, so we got to Nebuchadnezzar last week. Now in this one, this is chapter 5, right? Mm-hmm. This is chapter 5. Chapter 4 was the last one of Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5 is a Belshazzar chapter, but it's at the very end of Belshazzar's reign. Chapter 7 is in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. Chapter 8 is in the third year of Belshazzar's reign. Chapter 7 is in, chapter 5 is in the last year of Belshazzar's reign. They're all out of order chronologically. But what Daniel's book is the first 6 chapters are the historical stories, and the last 6 chapters are the prophecies. So they grouped them according to the type of literature. Okay. So what happens is this. So you start with Daniel 1. Nebuchadnezzar takes control of Judah in 605 BC. 587 BC, after they've been in Babylon for 18 years, Babylon destroys Jerusalem, and there's nothing left of Judah anymore. 553 BC, Belshazzar becomes king. And Daniel has his first vision. That's Daniel chapter 7. Now, Daniel's been in Babylon for 52 years at this time. Okay, so Daniel is not a kid anymore. If you figure Daniel is maybe a young guy when they take these captives over to Judah, even if Daniel is, say, 15 years old when they take him as captive, Daniel is in his 60s, maybe 70s, when he has his first actual vision. Okay, that's Daniel 7. Daniel 8, he has his second vision in about 551 BC. And then back to Daniel 5, which is today, Belshazzar's feast is the last year of Belshazzar's reign. Daniel's been in Babylon for about 66 years. Okay, so Daniel's a pretty old guy by now. He's 80-ish, or, in his 80s. Comparatively old guy. Somewhat old guy.
I didn't even have to say
He's
that.
not a spring chicken. He's not a spring chicken anymore when he has this. Okay. no
lot of
finger
wisdom
pointing at
over
that
there.
end of the table.
There's a lot of wisdom over there, though.
The other thing to say about this too is that it's kind of hard to tell from the biblical record, because they just keep using the word king, but it seems from the historical record outside the Bible, it kind of seems as though in the Bible, it seems like, so you had Nebuchadnezzar, and then you had Belshazzar, and then you had Darius, and then you had Cyrus. And it may not necessarily be entirely the way it was. It kind of seems like Belshazzar didn't necessarily follow Nebuchadnezzar immediately as the same type of emperor. It seems as though Belshazzar, from this historical record of the Babylonians, might have been the equivalent of the vice president of an emperor named Nabonidus, who was another Babylonian. So think of it this way. So let's assume that we have, in this country we have President Trump and Vice President Pence, but we have no means of instant communication. We have no telephone, we have no Twitter, which in some cases would be a blessing, but we'll let that pass. We have no electronic communication, nothing like that. So there's no way for instant communication. So now let's assume that the president, and in these days, if the president goes to, say, Singapore to negotiate with the North Koreans, he goes and he comes back within a few days, but even when he's in Singapore, he's in constant instant communication with Washington, D.C. So the vice president is basically just sitting around twiddling his thumbs, waiting for the president to get sick. And that's all pretty much is what he's doing, okay? But if there was no instant communication, and there were no jet planes in it, it'd take the president a month to travel to Singapore, and then he'd do his thing, and then a month to get back. So in that 2 months' time, he'd be completely away from the business of Washington, D.C. to do that. So in the meantime, who's in charge of the country while he's off doing whatever he's doing in Singapore? Well, it would have to be the vice president. So that's what was going on in the ancient world. A lot of times you'd have the emperor might be off doing some other business, negotiating with some other country, conducting a war, and he'd be leaving his vice emperor in charge back home in Babylon or Rome or whatever it was. Okay, so Belshazzar in this one, we're not real clear from the historical record that he was actually the emperor of Babylon, but he was more like the vice president at the time, and the emperor that succeeded Nebuchadnezzar was actually a guy named Nabonidus. And Belshazzar was like his vice president, who was in charge of Babylon while Nabonidus was off doing some imperial sort of thing, waging war against the Medes and the Persians. And when Belshazzar died and Nabonidus was defeated, then the Medes and the Persians came in and overthrew the Babylonians. So even though the biblical record says Belshazzar was the successor of Nebuchadnezzar, it's not necessarily immediate successor. Okay? And sometimes in the ancient texts, in the Old Testament, it'll say something like Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, when it means he was the successor of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, they'll do that with the pharaohs and that kind of
That's a big difference.
Yeah, it seems to be a big difference to us, but it wasn't really a big difference to them, because it was a sign of legitimacy for them, I mean, it wasn't like Belshazzar just kind of stepped in and took over, but to say he was the son of Nebuchadnezzar was he might not have been the biological son, but he was the legitimate successor to the throne, and so they called him the son. Okay. So anyway, here we are, Belshazzar's feast. At the end of Belshazzar's reign, let's see, 553, Belshazzar pretty much takes over there. 539, so that's, what, 53 to 30, what's 53 minus 39? It's about 14 years he's there, and he has this feast. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. And this is a wondrous kind of incident, and so a lot of people have taken a look at it. Up on the screen behind me, there's a lot of different pictures. This is Rembrandt, and there's all these different people who have painted these pictures, usually in the Renaissance period. And so there's all these people in these Renaissance costumes doing this massive thing, these orgies, and some of them, the heavens just kind of open up the ceiling, like this one here, by the English painter John Martin. Sir William Walton wrote this long piece called Belshazzar's Feast for orchestra and choir. It's kind of interesting if you got the patience to listen to it, but you know. And then there's this, so we'll get to that in a minute. This is Rembrandt again. So let's read about Belshazzar's Feast in Daniel chapter 5. Somebody read verses 1 through 4, please.
King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone.
Okay, thanks very much. So you remember that when Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem, he emptied the temple and took all of the treasures of God that were in the temple of Jerusalem and put them in the temple of his God in Babylon and just left them there. They didn't do anything with them, he just left them there in the treasury of the temple. Now Belshazzar says, oh, we got a bunch of gold and silver goblets in the temple of Jerusalem. They're doing nothing in the temple, and they're from Jerusalem. They're doing nothing there, so let's bring them out. And the note here says, let's bring them out and we can, you know, play the equivalent of beer pong and jello shots with them. You know, whatever the Babylonians did. If they'd had jello shots in those days, they would. Okay. In a few minutes, we'll talk about sacrilege. Okay, so that's what they're doing. And instead of, you know, and this is the stuff that's been consecrated to the Lord, the God of the Israelites, and they're praising the gods of gold and silver and bronze and so forth. Okay. Thank you. So somebody, 5 and 6, please.
Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way.
Okay, so there you have it on the screen behind me. There's the king watching the hand writing on the wall. Okay, and he does look pretty astonished there. Okay, writing the graffiti of God on the wall. All right, 7, 8, and 9, please, somebody.
The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled.
Very good, okay. And there's a reason why his nobles were baffled. And it's baffled me for a long time when I looked at this picture until I realized that this is, see, these are Hebrew letters, but the words go down instead of across. I've been trying to read these for years, and it's like, what the heck? I don't understand. Now, if I read them down, it's like, oh, okay, now I get it. So Rembrandt did it down as opposed to across, and that would baffle them even more if they didn't get it. So that's the puzzle of God, I guess.
Question,
Yes.
He will be made third highest ruler in the kingdom. Does that maybe support what you said? That,
Yeah,
you know, that Belshazzar is second tier.
yeah, it might be.
Okay.
That might be, I don't know that
Right.
for sure, but it
Yeah.
might be. Okay. Okay, so somebody pick it up with 10, 11, and 12, please.
The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve different problems. Call for Daniel, and he'll tell you what the writing means."
Okay, so there you have it. Now, this says, that the note at the bottom of the page in these Bibles says, maybe the queen mother, possibly the queen, the wife of Belshazzar was at this banquet, but his mother was not. Okay, she'd have been the queen mother, so she might have been coming in hearing all the thing, but who knows. So she says, well, why don't you call for Daniel, and we'll see what happens. So, 13 through 16, somebody please.
So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and understanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom."
Okay, so if you could tell me what it means, we'll give you lots of bling. Okay, and 17, somebody just read just verse 17.
Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means."
Okay, yeah, I don't need your bling, but I'll tell you what it means. Okay, so what does it mean, 18 through 21? This is the prelude.
O
Somebody,
King, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the people and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes.
okay, so that's the prelude, that's the previous history, and we've heard all of this, right? Okay, thank you. 22 through 29, or 28 rather.
But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he set the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written.
I dare you.
Okay.
No. Usually it's pronounced mene mene tekel farsin.
This is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perse, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom.
Okay, thanks, you can stop there. Okay, so Daniel, our little page, or their handout says Daniel preaches the law to Belshazzar, and that's what the law does. It says, this is where you've screwed up, this is where you've done wrong, okay? You knew all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar, you knew what the consequences of his sin was, and yet you went along and did something very similar, okay? You brought out these things, you praised the gods of gold and iron and stone, even though you were using the treasures of the one true God in your banquet. You were using these against his will, and this is a sin. And so here's your punishment. And there it is on the, on the wall. The hand has come out from God himself, and he's writing on the wall, this is your punishment. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You've been weighed on the scales and found wanting, and your kingdom will now be divided. And then Belshazzar does this thing. He keeps his word. He gives him the golden chains anyway. He makes him the third in command in the kingdom, but he doesn't repent. Okay? He doesn't say, oh, I'm sorry, please intercede for me. What do I need to do? He doesn't put on sackcloth and ashes. He doesn't do any of the usual repenting things. He just does what he promised to Daniel. There's no sign that he's even sorry for any of those kind of things. He just says, okay, that's, he's almost like resigned to it now at this point.
Or doesn't believe it.
Or he doesn't believe it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe that's why. I don't know. And now, as I said, on here, Rembrandt chooses to do this in, this is not the way it's usually written in Hebrew. Usually Hebrew is written across from right to left. It's not usually written down like this, so maybe Rembrandt did it that way just to show a little bit of confusion, to write it down. At any rate, that's the deal. So somebody read verse 30 and 31.
That very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62.
Okay, that was the end of Belshazzar, and Darius the Mede becomes king. And Daniel's been there for 66 years. Okay. So there you have it. By the way, I don't think this is a real picture of Darius.
No,
A
that
Darius.
would be Darius, Robert.
This is a Darius, but this is not the Darius, the Mede.
He's a good singer, by the way.
Who, Darius the Mede?
Darius, Robert.
We have no proof of that.
Yes, I do.
Huh?
So we have no proof of that.
Darius the Mede was a good singer.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk, any questions on this chapter so far? All right, let's talk about where it says part 2 on the handout, because this was the issue for Daniel and Belshazzar in chapter 5, was sacrilege, basically, was the issue. And I took these definitions pretty much right out of the most authoritative source I could find, Wikipedia. So here's the definition, and in order to get to sacrilege, we've got to start with other things. So consecration is a word which means consecration happens when a group of people sets aside a person, place, or thing to be sacred or for sacred purposes. For example, priests, pastors, churches, temples, shrines, altars, temple vessels, etc. So, here at Christ the King, we have, the silver chalice that we use for communion, that common cup thing, that we've said, we set that aside for sacred purposes, and we use that for communion. That's the only thing we use that chalice for. We don't bring it in here to use it for lemonade or, put mixed nuts in or things like that. We only use it for communion. It's used for sacred purposes. That's consecration. And same thing with the sanctuary. We consecrate the sanctuary, the church, when we have that kind of stuff. Deconsecration happens when the group of people who have consecrated the person, place, or thing with the same group later agree to revoke their common understanding of the sacredness of the object. For instance, just before a congregation sells its church building, if we're going to sell the building to another group, it's oftentimes a good practice to have a service of decommissioning or deconsecration. Okay, so that the group that owns it, the congregation that owns it, says, we have dedicated all of this and consecrated it to the Lord, and now we are all together agreeing that, as we're going to sell this to another group, this is no longer set aside for that holy and sacred purpose. It may be in their minds and in their memory set aside for that, but from this day forward, it's not set aside for that purpose. Okay, so you often will have a service of deconsecration or decommissioning. Yeah.
Does consecration and deconsecration have to be a specific act, a service, or something like that? Or can it, you said a service of deconsecration.
It's cleaner that way.
Okay.
I'll say it that way. It's cleaner that way. Okay, because like I said, if you have a church, for instance, if this church, for instance, this church building. Oh no, let's take a different church building. Let's take Pentecost in Lakewood, for instance. Okay, so up in Lakewood, we have two church buildings. We have Pentecost Lutheran Church Building and Saints Peter and Paul Lutheran Church Building. And the two churches, the congregations went through a process where they then became one church, Grace Lutheran Church. Now they have two buildings that they can't maintain. And so they decided to sell one building, which was the Pentecost building. In the minds and hearts, in the minds and memories of the people, that was the Pentecost Lutheran Church building. But the group they were going to sell it to wanted to make it a cultural and community center, which is fine. It's a good building for that purpose. So just to make it, everybody's understanding clean and make a clean cutoff, the best thing for the congregation of Grace to do would be to have a deconsecration service where they say, this was the altar, but we're removing it. This was the sanctuary, but it is no longer to be understood by anybody as this is a place, a sacred place where only God is, where God alone is to be worshipped. These are the sacred vessels. We remove all the things that can be removed that are sacred. The place itself is no longer to be considered sacred, that kind of stuff. So we basically desacredize it. That's what deconsecration is. And it's cleaner that way, so that we can say, in our memory it was a sacred place, but it really isn't anymore. So that there is a specific date to say, that's when we all together got all together and said, this is the date when it ceased being sacred. Yeah, because otherwise you could just say, well, we sold it to those guys and now they own it. And somebody said, yeah, but it's still a church. Because we never got together and officially said it wasn't. So, that's at least theoretically, that's officially what we would do, at least in the Missouri understand this to say. To make everything clean and above board and have a cutoff date, have a service of deconsecration.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Do
Richard.
other denominations do that too, or is it just?
You know, I don't know, I think some of them might, I think, actually it depends on the denomination. Some might insist on it, some might recommend it. You know, I don't know for
The
sure.
reason why I'm bringing that up, one time I was in Hudson, killing some time to get my car looked at.
Yeah,
And there were churches there that were Christian churches, but now they're some type of cult or some type of Buddhism or whatever.
yeah,
That's what they're practicing now in those churches, so that's the only reason why
yeah, there's one in Strongsville on Pearl Road just north of Route 82 that's now a Buddhist temple. It used to be a Christian church.
oh, yeah.
And, you know, when the Christians sold that to the Buddhists, I don't know how they did that. I don't know if they
I
deconsecrated
think
it
there was a
first.
Methodist church.
Yeah, and I don't know if they
I think-
deconsecrated it first or not, but the recommendation at least is, you know, make it a clean break. Deconsecrate it, and if the Buddhists are gonna buy it and use it as a temple, let them reconsecrate it as a Buddhist temple. Yeah, Pam?
The church that we went to in Lakewood also decommissioned, had a decommissioning service. We went up for that. And they did that even before they put the building up for sale.
Yeah.
The church were the people and they were gone from that site, so then they could put the building up.
Yeah, yeah.
But are some of those churches consecrated in the first place?
Well, usually you do have a, you know, when you frequently, well, yeah, I can't answer in any specific circumstance, but usually when you build a church, there's like a service of dedication, which is like a service of consecration, and you say, you know, this is the house of the Lord, you know, we brought in the altar and the pulpit and, you know, the seating and all that kind of stuff, so you do have a service of dedication at least. So you know, to get things going, to start things, you ought to have a service that says this is the end of that time period of consecration. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there are a lot of these small churches that preacher just starts one, I mean.
Well, yeah, that's
this is
true,
what I-
too.
And they're calling themselves Christians.
Yeah, that's true too. And there's like storefront churches and that kind of stuff. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about more like a freestanding building, but, you know, but I do wanna go on to the other things here and not get hung up on deconsecration. Because that's not what they were doing here in Belshazzar. They were sacrilegious or something different. Okay. So, yeah, a storefront church just kind of opens and closes without necessarily consecration of this storefront necessarily. Okay. So that's deconsecration. That's this congregation, like Pam's congregation, you know, or said that this is our building. We're closing it down, so we're going to say now it's no longer a sacred space, except in our memory. That's the deal. Desecration is when it's still a sacred space, but some other group comes in and uses it for non-sacred purposes. Okay, like it says here, usually by the disrespectful or contemptuous treatment of a sacred place or object by someone from outside the original consecrating group. Desecration is like, you know, when somebody comes in and build a gas station on Indian burial ground. Okay, or when, you know, a motorcycle club like Hell's Angels comes in and takes over a church and says, you know, we're taking over this church whether you like it or not, kicks out, you know, the congregation or whatever. That's desecration. You know, and that kind of thing. Sacrilege is the violation or injurious treatment of a sacred object or person in the form of irreverence to sacred persons, places, or things. Okay. When sacrilegious offense is verbal, it's called blasphemy. Okay. So, desecration and sacrilege are kind of similar. They're kind of similar, but the difference is there's something more intentional and long-term than with desecration. Okay? Desecration is to say, we're going, you know, like the motorcycle club that goes into the church and says, we're taking this over and we're gonna make it our clubhouse, but it's a church and we don't care. Sacrilege is when Belshazzar says, let's go to the temple treasury and let's grab those goblets and use them to drink out of. It's just a one-time, you know, maybe it's a one-off thing, and, you know, he's just being stupid. You know, but it's still sacrilege. But still, it's dishonoring that God, who is the true God, and the one that who it's designed for. So, having said all that, here's a question, and this is a thing that we did last time too. Sacrilege or freedom of expression? You be the judges. Let's see what you think. Okay, see these guys? See what they're wearing? Okay. Is that jewelry or is that confession? This is what we believe. Or is that just jewelry?
I think it depends on the individual.
It's confession.
You believe it.
It should be a confession because they, when they get jewelry like that, they make it holy. Or
Oh,
whatever.
they make it holy?
No, they do.
They consecrate it?
They
Because,
consecrate, whatever this word is.
because, okay. It's holy because of who's wearing it, is that what you're saying?
No,
Yeah.
they consecrate it, is that what I want to say?
Yes, that's what
Yes,
I
they
would-
consecrate it.
Why do they consecrate it? Isn't it just a statement of their faith?
That's what I'm saying. You know, that's why I say with jewelry or confession, it's a statement of their faith. I think you could make a case it's a statement of their faith.
Isn't that why you wear it?
That's why I wear it on Sunday, because it's a statement
But
of
they
our
also have
faith.
it blessed in the Catholic faith.
Yeah, but, so what?
Okay.
Unless they're
That's not why I
robes,
didn't
too.
ask this. I didn't ask if it was jewelry or holy, because I don't want to get into, you know, is it holy because of the person wearing it? No, it could be just as a confession of their faith, or is it just jewelry? Let's ask this question. Is that jewelry or is that confession? That's a great big head of Jesus right there.
That's still jewelry.
Is that still jewelry?
Yeah.
You don't think that's a confession of his faith? No? That's a whole lot bigger than all three of those crosses. Okay.
It's a confession of what he's not.
Why would he wear it
Who is that?
if it's not a confession?
Well,
Rap star.
that's a rapper whose name is that Flo Rida or is that,
I don't know which one.
So it could be jewelry and it could be sacrilege.
I think it's Flo Rida too.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's
I don't know who-
sacrilege,
I don't know who
but
it
he
is.
has said that he wears that because he thanks Jesus for everything he's done, and then he does these raps in front of all these
Yeah, right, about.
women who are shaking their behinds and
Yeah.
everything, and, you know, it's like,
Sacrilege.
That sounds like sacrilege.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So that would be
yeah, it's borderline somewhere on
best
there.
expression of
Expression of
Freedom
whatever.
of,
Thankfulness.
freedom of
An
expression.
That to me is just jewelry.
All right, what about this? Is this sacrilege or is this confession?
I didn't know about that.
Stupidity.
I like that answer, stupidity.
ignorance.
Well, when I was the delegate of this church, there was a preacher up, or a minister that was up in the conference. He had tattoos all over him.
Yeah,
Claiming the word of God.
yeah, well, that's, he's in St. Louis, and he has very specific tattoos, some in Hebrew, some in Greek, and so forth, and he does that because then people ask him, what's that all about? And he says, this is a Bible verse, and it says this, and let me talk to you about Jesus because of that. So he does that on purpose to do that. That's Dave Corson. Yeah, it's like a bait and catch kind of thing.
I think that's just up to the person, because look what Dennis did after his cancer.
Yeah, Dennis has a cross that he did after his cancer as a testimony. Flannery O'Connor has a great story called Parker's Back, in which a guy named Parker has an icon of Jesus like this on his back. And he thought it would be a good thing, and what ends up happening is he feels the eyes of Jesus just boring into his soul all the time, and he can't escape it. It's a great story. So who knows? How about this? Is this a sign of of what we believe, or a sign of commitment to what we believe? Or a little bit of both?
Both.
Yeah, I think it's both, you know, guys like this is what we believe, this is our commitment to this. How about this one? Is this freedom of expression or sacrilege, or what is this?
A little bit of both on that one.
A little bit of both, you think?
Big
On
swearing again.
this guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he's intending to portray with this.
Who is that guy?
That's George Michael.
George Michael.
He doesn't have a
Who's he?
he doesn't have a real strong Christian
No,
reputation,
no.
let's put it that way.
He's a rock star, but
Especially when I was up
he's,
there with Siley Meyer.
gay.
Yeah,
Was
Siley
gay.
Meyer.
Yeah.
Yeah, was gay, not anymore.
He's dead, isn't
He died,
Yeah.
This guy died?
How about this one? Is this sacrilege or freedom of expression?
Now, see, I go back with Dennis, I think that's freedom of expression. You don't know why he had that voice, you
Okay.
know. Did something happen in his life that he felt he needed to, you know?
But is that the answer to all of them? You know, what
Yeah.
is the, you know, what is the underlying reason
Yeah.
for it?
So it could
You know,
be
whether
either
it was George
depending.
Michael's or this guy or, you know,